Good morning. Good morning, good evening, and welcome. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and it's my enormous pleasure to moderate this morning's discussion. This morning, we have a chance to consider more fully the role of the private sector in conflict prevention and resolution, and indeed the private sector in fostering growth and contributing to conflict prevention. And we'll be hearing from two leaders who have extraordinary and deep experience in different regions of the world. We also have a chance to hear from Luis Alberto Moreno, who's presently at Allen and Company, but was president of the Inter-American Development Bank, I think for some 15 years, if I understood correctly. He also served as Colombia's ambassador to the United States and serves on the board of a number of corporations. And I know that Luis Alberto has been just such an effective regional head of a bank based in Washington, traveling the region, understanding both geopolitics, economics, and also how these regional institutions can operate with the private sector and in a multilateral institutional context as well. So thank you very much, Dr. Moreno, for being with us.
Let me, at the outset, I'll just perhaps look at it from the macro to the micro in terms of responding to your question, perhaps take a little bit of time in just doing that. Because I think what is really important is really moving away from rhetoric and into action. And this is where the private sector can make a huge difference. And the reality, of course, is that several emerging economies are all struggling with one form of conflict or another. In Latin America, you were mentioning, there's still, conflicts the way, the last of which was perhaps in my own country, in Colombia. You'll have a chance to talk about that at length, so I won't just do that. But you've also seen questions around citizen security. It costs countries sometimes as high as 8% of GDP just to deal with the consequences of citizen security because of crime and the huge advances in crime. So here, private sector contributions can truly pave the road for peace, and it turns, of course, into an excellent return on investment because it's a way to place itself at the center of the future of emerging markets. Not only the dynamism, the creativity, and the resilience of the private sector, which are truly major aspects for recovery and growth. And as such, the private sector is a critical contributor to build a path for peace in coordination and dialogue with the governments and citizens. And of course, it's a difficult task nonetheless. Now, there are a number of keys that I would like just to highlight that make this task both manageable and feasible, and where we have to look and go beyond. And let me start with one where it's typically been a source of conflict, especially in emerging countries, where many of them depend largely on extractive industries. And I think the question here is, how do you go beyond extractives? And the way to go beyond extractive industries, which, as I said earlier, sometimes are very much at the root of many of the conflicts that are created, because typically extractive industries take place in faraway places where governments are very weak, where government services are almost non-existent, and with a long-term commitment, developing really valuable and vibrant value chains with local enterprises and entrepreneurs. And this is something I think mining company extractives in general have learned to do recently. The private sector here is not only well endowed to open and develop innovative networks that can help homegrown creativity, and equally a grassroots understanding of the local context. And there, of course, the possibility of working with the different elements of civil society is something that I know Mutar always in our conversation stressed a lot, as he called it, the golden triangle is so central. The other part, and this is again, a change that needs to take place, is to go beyond just charity and grants and move into more stable flows of capital, of long-term commitments, that can essentially awaken an innovation spirit. And here, exploring direct investment, things like social impact bonds, this is something that has grown significantly lately, with what I would call more and more patient capital in innovation bonds, in alliances with multilateral organizations, political insurance. These kinds of things are very important as instruments to have in place. And also, another very important element is to go beyond the tensions and the antagonism of the private sector and governments at each other. And I think breaking through that and building trust becomes very important. And here I'm referring not just to all private agents, both for profits and not for profits, enterprises, entrepreneurs, local, international employers, and employees, of course. And that alliance that can be built, again, through this golden triangle, is critical for that long-term commitment that one needs, and fueled by a constant dialogue that creates the spaces for building trust. And go also beyond the so-called do not harm, do good. The private sector is part of that social fabric and should be aware of his critical role in making that sustainable. Social engagement, for instance, is a critical piece of private investment that sometimes is omitted. And high standards of compliance with human rights, with fair labor practices, with payments of taxes, that monitor, for instance, public expenditure with high quality data. This is something that citizens need. And it is companies that are responsible in this space that can really help shape the conversation in countries against those who are just extractive in nature. So being socially responsible not only is it good for the community where you're established, but it truly creates a great foundation for growth that is, of course, money-wise and is good for the capital market. So the other aspect I would call is the go and stay. Warren Buffett, one of the most renowned investors, used the expression of putting the skin in the game when you look at the investments and how to align those incentives of both owners and managers of companies. And if you were to extend that aphorism, the private sector and citizens should reap the benefits of peace. Once by having, of course, an nonviolent environment to invest and have returns to investment. The others by having productive jobs, stable incomes, better products and services, and the potential of economic mobility, which is so important in today's world. And when you look at the huge disparities in income that we've seen, the minute you start losing social mobility, you begin to fuel the fire of inequality, and inequality is really what breeds populism. So this is an extremely important aspect. So by creating quality jobs, by training future employees and working on how to replace constantly your workforce, that fosters, of course, technological transfers and improves products and services available both to citizens and the private sector, could create the kinds of incentives to protect peace and prevent social conflict and violence. And in this context of conflict and volatile environments, I think pragmatism is a winner, and have a conflict risk mitigation and conflict management solutions. This is another aspect that I think is very critical. And finally, don't be naive, but also do not be cynic, rather be passionate and pragmatic. And that's what I found in leaders like Mutar when he was at the helm of Coca-Cola, in looking at he always used to say Coca-Cola is a local company, because he always understood that it had to do with the local communities. And so it's very important to be ready as a result, to be able to manage risk and conflict resolution. Be there, dreaming. We should dream. I think this is an important element to dream. And I have seen in a city in my own country, which was Medellin, how that dreaming came together. I mean, here it was a city in the 80s. It was the capital of what was then called the Medellin cartel. It was perhaps at one point the most violent city in the world. And today is recognized as a global hub of innovation with very high levels of investment, both local and foreign. And more importantly, a huge awakening of what I would call civic capital. This is, the participations of citizens to look at working together and striving to have a better city. And many have called this the Medellin miracle, but it was the result of a commitment, a resolute commitment, both by the public and the private sector, to restore peace and, more importantly, economic growth. It was a coalition of empresarios, of business entrepreneurs, of universities, and community-based organizations working together that brought life back to the city, and it helped equally advance in the solving many pressing social issues. So not only, of course, it is not finished, it is not all done, but clearly there's a roadmap to go ahead, and it has been open, and the society at large is beginning to walk this path. So in closing, I would just say that there are no shortcuts for this, but a path to be walked by the private sector with and with the private sector, a path of hope. And here I like to, it's a great writer, Anna Emily Dixon said, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the souls and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." So let's not stop, and let this be kind of the inspiration of what the Mutar had in putting this center together. And I'm sure Jean Marie and others will continue in this very direction. So thank you, and can start from there to talk about any other issues that you want. There's a lot of violence. Of course, nothing happens without security. That's a necessity. But equally, that's not enough for economic development. And so you need to begin to look and map the different areas, from things like determining, and there's many ways to do it. I mean, there's a former police chief in New York had this idea of what they call the broken window kind of thought. He was a very successful, as you know, police commissioner in New York, that basically you can begin with data today to identify places in a city where most of the violence is concentrated. And then based on that, you very quickly go and look into that area of that neighborhood, what is happening. So I give you an example. We found that in many of these communities, there was no space for sport. And typically, whatever soccer field or football or whatever, it became the area where gangs got together. So then we decided to put a program together where you would put lighting such that people could and the community could celebrate sports in the evening. And the cost of that lighting was paid by the community, precisely to create a collective action kind of effort. And immediately, the first thing that happened was that the community occupied the places where there was violence. And those violence actors, as a result, began to be removed. And that allowed law enforcement to do its part. Equally, what happens with education, and how do you, build up the capacities of education, of healthcare, of places where you resolve conflicts. We had the so-called justice houses, where arbitraging basic conflicts in a home, or a problem with a rent, or a problem of a stealing of a bicycle. I mean, things as basic as that, where you can resolve those kinds of conflicts. Well, this really became a war of the Medellin cartel against the rest of the city of Medellin. I mean, they were essentially, intimidating everybody. They killed, hundreds of policemen. Pablo Escobar was famous for saying that he would pay something like $500 at the time for every policeman that they killed. They equally were after judges. They were after Supreme Court members, prosecutors, you name it. So they were all about destroying, the rule of law in the country. And that, of course, meant that a number of people were either kidnapped or killed. But at the end, people, which is really the admirable thing, decided to stay and to fight it out. And that took a lot of cooperation between, business, civil society, universities, and others to begin a process by which to confront these different groups. And it meant that they had to, in this golden triangle that Mutar talks, to be very, very aligned. And it was a long journey, but little by little, as the national government, of course, was able to not only take down many of these, take down essentially the Medellin cartel, but equally, it was all the elements around the Medellin cartel, which were all these young killers that they had. It all required really big investments inside a different set of communities where many of these so-called hitmen, which were kids under 18, which were basically induced into this by the Medellin cartel because they were more difficult to put in jail, more difficult to criminalize. Uh, and it really took a lot of investment in those communities to begin to win the peace. And that's how it was done. And little by little, the city began to turn around. I still remember when the 50-year anniversary of the IDB, with this, the Colombian government wanted to host the IDB meeting, and they did it in Medellin. And people, we have 48 shareholders there, 48 shareholder governments. Many people were literally very scared to come to Medellin. And eventually, we demonstrated that all the security and nothing would happen. People came there and they were so fascinated by the city that they actually went back as tourists. And that helped. That was kind of one of the moments that the city began to change its image, but more importantly, to show that it was a beginning of a new day. And then they started doing things like one of the biggest fashion. Medellin used to be a very important textile hub, so they started doing these very big fashion shows, and they little by little they started showing that they could do some of the things that their industrial base could develop, and they did it they always had a very strong entrepreneurial spirit, and they were able to little by little change that. And then the last thing that they did was to create essentially kind of a Colombian Silicon Valley in Medellin, where they would essentially, I mean, Hewlett Packard, for instance, set up a place there. I remember talking to Condi Rice about this when she was in their board, and she actually recommended that they do it. Say, what, Colombia? Where? Medellin? You're crazy. And little by little, as they went there, they saw that the talent was there, that there was the human potential and the workforce that could turn around the city. For example, we supported a group of very savvy young entrepreneurs in Peru who decided that they saw this huge acceleration of technology and how difficult it was for startups in Latin America to find people to work. They don't find enough people to work, so they began a program of training, especially girls who had gone through, graduated from high school, middle class, were studying into university, were dropouts, etc., to just teach them to write code. And that program, for instance, has been extremely successful in finding ways to, one of the fascinating things today around technology is how difficult it is to find people. And many and these are in areas of engineering, in areas of code, etc. And here you need essentially to have the different universities to align and work together towards creating a bigger pool of people that can go into these fields. If you look at manpower, their statistics, they tell you something shocking. 50% of the jobs that the labor market is demanding are not being found, and they're not being found because of a skills mismatch. And so one has to very quickly work with business and begin to determine on both the supply and the demand side, where are those mismatches? That's part of the journey that we have to take on to deal with these problems of youth unemployment.
It's been our pleasure, and we hope to welcome you to New York. Ours is a school that really wants to focus on these interdisciplinary challenges when economics and security, economic growth, security, and the environment, they come together in thinking about these problems and solving them, but also have to be infused with understanding local conditions and multiple complex parties. Jean-Marie, the last word.
Well, just to thank all of you and thank also the audience for very good questions. I think each session we feel we could have a whole week to discuss the topic. So this program is just the beginning of a series of workshop and engagement, because what we clearly see is the need for these various actors in their own, each in their own field, to engage with each other more. And that's what we have done this morning, and that's what we plan to do in the future. Thank you.